Hello everyone, and welcome back to another election analysis video. But before we start, I would really appreciate it if you guys could help me grow my platform by subscribing. Anyways, today we're going to be going over current polling in the 2024 presidential election. And while Democratic nominee Kamala Harris is growing her numbers in many key swing state polling, I am making this video to see how Republican nominee Donald Trump would fare if he were to outperform the 538 polling in the same fashion he outperformed the polling in the 2020 presidential election. So the reason I'm making this video is because if we were to predict the election by how the polls look at face value, we would see that Kamala Harris is predicted to win the election. Whether you look at right-wing leaning pollsters or forecasters such as Real Clear Politics to left-wing leaning forecasters such as 538, we could see that Kamala Harris is predicted to win the election based off of how current polling looks like. And while I'm not going to look at each state individually on 538, just so you know, their election map basically looks the exact same as how it did in 2020, and 538's map is pretty close. But no matter how you look at it, Kamala Harris is pretty much predicted to win the election purely based off of how polling looks like. But as we all know, election results don't always translate into how polling look like. But basically, I want to make this video just to see what possible scenario could look like if Donald Trump were to outperform the polls this time the same way he did in 2020. It might not happen, but it's worth seeing how it would look like because it is a possibility based off of history in 2016 and in 2020. So we're going to look at 538's election map and basically shift all of the states to the right by however much Trump outperformed them in 2020 and predict how the election would look like if Donald Trump were to outperform the polls this year the same way he did in 2020. So laid out in front of you now, I've created an electoral map that predicts how all of the states will vote by looking at all of the 538 aggregate polling at face value. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through each state roughly west to east and push them to the right by however many points Trump outperformed in them in 2020 relative to 538 and see how Trump could perform. So the first state we'll look at is Nevada. And according to 538 aggregate polling, Kamala Harris is projected to take the state of Nevada by 1.2%. But in 2020, Trump outperformed in Nevada by 2 points. And so if we shift the state to the right by 2 points, we can see that Trump takes the state by just under a percentage point. The next state we look at is Arizona. And according to 538, Kamala Harris is leading in Arizona by 0.3%. And in 2020, Donald Trump outperformed 538's Arizona polling by 2%. So if we shift the state to 2 points to the right, we can see that he takes Arizona by around 1.7%. And now the next state is Wisconsin. We move on to the Rust Belt. According to 538, Kamala Harris is leading in the state of Wisconsin by 3.6%. However, in 2020, Trump massively, and I mean massively, outperformed the polls in Wisconsin. 538 was wrong in its polling by 8 percentage points. Trump outperformed the polls by 8% in 2020. And if he were to do the same this year with 538, he would take the state by just under 5%, which is insane to me at least. And now we move on to another demographically similar state, Michigan. And according to 538, Kamala Harris is projected to take the state of Michigan by a roughly safe margin of 2.6%. However, if we were to shift the state to the right by 5 points, which is how much Trump outperformed, we would see Trump take the state by a roughly, ironically, similar margin of around 2.5%. And now we move on to Pennsylvania, which is another demographically similar state. 538 aggregate polling has Kamala Harris leading in Pennsylvania by 1.4%. And in 2020, Trump outperformed in Pennsylvania by 3%. So if we shift the state to the right, again, we can see that also takes this state by a roughly similar margin Kamala Harris is currently leading it in. And now we move on to Georgia. According to 538's aggregate polling, we can see that Kamala Harris is leaning by half a percentage point, and polling was fairly accurate in 2020, and Trump only outperformed there by 1%, but still in the model we're creating, he takes the state by, again, the same margin Kamala Harris is currently leading in that state's polling. So what I want to do now is I want to analyze Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, which will admittedly be pretty hard since there's not a lot of polling available out of there. But what I am going to do is I am going to look at the only 2 polling sources that polled both in 2020 and in 2024, Chains Research and Emerson College. And we can see here in 2020 that they actually underestimated Joe Biden, unlike most of the country in the 2020 election cycle. They projected Joe Biden to take the district by around 2 to 3 percentage points when he ended up taking it by around 6 percentage points. If we go look at polling in 2024, we can see that Change Research had Donald Trump taking the congressional district by 18 percentage points, and Emerson College had Donald Trump taking the district by 16 percentage points. Huge shift to the right according to these polling sources. And even though Joe Biden's not the nominee anymore, I find it very hard to believe that Kamala Harris being the Democratic nominee could shift the political environments of the congressional district by double digits, let alone 16 percentage points or 18 percentage points. So even with Kamala Harris being the nominee, I don't know if she can make up that margin. Even though Joe Biden outperformed the polls in Nebraska's 2nd congressional district by around 3 to 4 percentage points in 2020, if we shift these polls to the left by 3 to 4 percentage points, Kamala Harris would still have to make up a 12 to 14% deficit in the polling. So even taking into account Kamala Harris being the new Democratic nominee, I still think Donald Trump may be able to take Nebraska's 2nd congressional district under a best case scenario for him if he were to outperform the polls. And so there you have it. I have Donald Trump taking Nebraska's 2nd congressional district in a best case scenario where he outperforms the polls like he did in 2020. So after that, just so you guys know, Donald Trump doesn't flip any more electoral votes if he outperforms the polls again this year. However, I am going to shift the remaining relatively competitive states based off of how much Trump outperformed the polls in them in 2020 compared to the 538 aggregate polling. So first is Iowa. Aggregate polling has Iowa going to Trump by 9, and Trump outperformed the polls there in 2020 by 7. So we can put that in the safe column for Trump. Same thing with Ohio, basically same polling. Aggregate polling has Trump taking Ohio by 7, and Trump outperformed there by 5 in 2020. So that becomes another safe state. Same thing with Texas. Texas is projected to go to Trump by 5 according to aggregate polling, but Trump outperformed the polls there by 5 in 2020. So that also goes into the safe column. Florida is projected to go to Trump by 4% according to aggregate polling, but Trump outperformed there by 6 percentage points in 2020. So that also goes into the safe column, surprisingly. And next is New Hampshire. New Hampshire is the aggregate polling there is around 7.2%, and Trump outperformed the polls there by 4% in 2020. So that shifts from likely to lean Democrat. And now main aggregate polling has Harris up 17 percentage points in the state. However, Trump outperformed the polls there by 2 percentage points in 2020. So it stays safe. And next is Minnesota, which 538 aggregate polling has going to Kamala Harris by 9.1%. And Trump outperformed the polls there by 2 percentage points in 2020. So if the state were to go to Kamala Harris by the same margin it went for Biden in 2020, 7.1%, that wouldn't be completely unrealistic. Next is the state of Virginia, which is projected to go to Kamala Harris by 3 percentage points in the latest poll. However, Trump did outperform there by 2 percentage points in 2020. Even in this conservative prediction I'm doing, Kamala Harris still takes the state of Virginia by a lead margin in the Democratic column. So next we have New Mexico, which is projected to go to Kamala Harris between 6 to 10 percentage points in 2020. However, according to Nate Silver, Trump did outperform 538's polling in New Mexico by roughly 1 percentage point. So we're going to shift New Mexico from the safe column to the likely column. And now we have the state of Colorado, which the Democrat Joe Biden actually outperformed in 2020, where Nate Silver, he said that Joe Biden outperformed the polls in Colorado by 1 percentage point. But since it already went to Joe Biden by 13 percentage points last election and is polling around the same this election cycle, the color's not going to shift and it's still going to stay likely blue. So there you guys have it. Here is the election map. If Donald Trump outperforms the 538 election polling in the same fashion he outperformed 538 in 2020, according to Nate Silver's tweet here. And this is the map, 313 for Donald Trump to Kamala Harris's 225. Anyways, before I finish the video, I do feel like it's worth mentioning that there are many good arguments as to why Trump might not outperform the polls this time, since he's a much more known character, since many more people are more likely to announce that they support Trump. With him getting shot and him being convicted, it has really risen many strong convictions in many of voters. So there is a chance he may not outperform the polls like he did in 2020 or at all, just because of what has happened in recent history. But anyways, there you guys have it. Here is the final map. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I shall see you guys later.